All right, welcome back to ABA exam review and the continuation of our BCBA practice exam series, where we're going through another set of practice exam questions together and breaking them down. If you're new to the channel, welcome. If you're returning, welcome back. Please like and subscribe. Check out behavioranalyststudy.com for all of our study materials, including our combo pack. When you pass the exam, please let us know so we can include you in the Sunday shout out. Work hard, study hard. Let's get going. You're playing War, a card game with your cousin. Put down the nine of spades, and your cousin puts down the nine of spades. Your cousin says, exact match, that means war. What do the nine of spades most resemble? All right, so we're always going to attack the question first. We never jump straight to the answer choices. In this case, it's one of those rare exceptions where the answer choices are going to help you identify what it is you're looking to answer. Because the question, what do the nine of spades most resemble, can mean a bunch of different things. So if we're looking at what we know from the question, we know you're playing this card game. You put down the nine of spades. Your cousin puts down the nine of spades. They say exact match. So the 9 equals to 9, or A equals A. And so if we're thinking about our behavior analytic terminology, when are we starting to talk about stimuli that are more or less equivalent to each other? Well, when we talk about stimulus equivalence. And with stimulus equivalence, we're usually talking about derived relations where we don't have these trained relations, and that's relative to reflexivity, symmetry, and transitivity. And so, really, the most difficult part about our stimulus equivalence questions is understanding what does reflexivity represent, what does symmetry represent, what does transitivity represent. So, while this isn't a traditional or conventional stimulus equivalence question, we more or less can assume, based on the information, that the nine of spades most resemble reflexivity. Because with reflexivity, we're talking A equals A. If we had symmetry, we'd be talking A equals B, B equals A. And then transitivity, we'd be A equals B, B equals C, A equals C. So again, we don't have a traditional derived relations question here, but the question is testing your knowledge of the different types of equivalence. And so you need to know what is reflexivity, what is symmetry, what is transitivity. If you know that, this question becomes rather easy. I think stimulus equivalence is one of those ideas that when you first start learning, it can be quite difficult. But once you get a hang of what the question wants you to know and the difference between these three types of equivalents, these questions become quite easy. So the nine of spades most resemble reflexivity. George Costanza has figured out that he can take naps under his desk at work and no one will notice. Since then, George has started taking multiple naps every week. George's friend asked him if he is worried that he will get caught, and George told his friend that his plan is flawless. If you wanted to calculate rate relative to George napping, what would you need? So we have a measurement question, and it's phrased a little differently because the question wants you to calculate rate, but it's asking what do you need in order to find rate? Well, let's think about what rate is. Rate is frequency over time. And so in order to find rate, you don't just need the count and you don't just need a unit of time, you need both. Because what you're going to do is you're going to take that frequency and put it over time, and you're going to find that ratio. You're going to find how many times it happened per units of time. And so if you want to calculate rate relative to George napping, what are we going to need? Well, let's find these two variables. So George Costanza has figured out he can take naps under his desk at work. No one will notice. Now he's taking multiple naps every week. And so you're essentially trying to figure out how many naps per week will George need to take. And so we could use frequency. We could count how many naps he takes. And then we could use weeks as our time. And we'd have naps per week. So what do we need to find rate? Well, A, how many times George is napping? You do. You need a frequency to find rate, but you also need a time component. That's the primary difference between rate and frequency. And why those two, while often used interchangeably, are not necessarily the same thing. Do you need a time frame relative to George napping? Yes, you do. But you also need a frequency. So A and B are good, but we need those together. So if we look at C, both the time frame and how often George is napping, that's what we're looking for. That is going to help us find our rate. And then D, how long George is napping each time he does nap. Well, that'll be a duration, not necessarily what we're looking for here. In order to find rate, you need a frequency and unit of time, and you put that frequency over time. And in this case, we would get how many naps per week George is taking. So what would we need to find rate? We need a time frame and how often George. Michael asks Dwight where he's been, and Dwight says, the dentist. Michael then asks, what is your dentist's name? And Dwight says, Crentist. Michael says, your dentist's name is Crentist. Michael asking Dwight where he's been is a blank. We have verbal behavior questions here, and verbal behavior is pretty straightforward because there's so many, or there's so few options you really have to choose from. Because when we think about our verbal operants, there are only a select few we need to know. And so the most important thing we want to know about verbal behavior is we have a speaker, we have a listener. We're concerned with the function of the communication. And then we want to know what's evoking the language and what's reinforcing the language. If we can answer those questions, we're going to be okay. Point-to-point correspondence also helps. Informal similarity also helps. But here, let's first start with what is the question asking about? Well, the question is asking about Michael asking Dwight where he's been. And so when we have behavior questions, and especially on the exam, when you have behavior questions with multiple scenarios, multiple people, it's very important in the question that you identify what we need to answer. So we're looking at Michael asking Dwight where he's been. And that's right here. Michael asked Dwight where he's been. So that's the behavior we're looking at. We have several other behaviors, but we're looking at Michael asking Dwight where he's been. So that's the first exchange in this interaction. Now, what evoked Michael asking Dwight where he's been? Well, it wasn't a verbal operant because the first exchange we have is Michael asking Dwight that question. So Michael is asking Dwight a question. He needs information. So Michael's behavior is being evoked by a motivating operation. And so if we think about attacked is evoked by a non-verbal stimulus where you're more or less labeling something. Now, Michael is not labeling anything here. Michael's asking for information. He's demanding for information. Michael asking Dwight where he's been is evoked by some sort of motivating operation for information. So Michael's asking Dwight where he's been looks like a demand. It isn't a transcription, right? Because a transcription, it's being evoked by a verbal stimulus where you're writing and copying things down. And Michael is not writing and copying things down. And it isn't an interverbal because an interverbal is evoked by a verbal stimulus. So when Michael asks Dwight where he's been, and Dwight says dentist, Dwight saying dentist is now an interverbal. So this is actually a pretty straightforward question, but if you were a little lost, go back and brush up on your verbal operants. The first place you want to start in verbal behavior questions is asking yourself, what evoked that behavior? And what evoked Michael asking Dwight? Well, it's not a verbal stimulus. So it's either got to be a nonverbal tact, right? Or typically a motivating operation mand, because that's what evokes those two operants. So Michael asking Dwight where he's been, he's manding for information. Michael asking Dwight where he's been is going to be a C mand. Again, know what evokes your verbal behaviors, know what reinforces them, no point to point, no formal similarity, and these questions become a lot easier. Jace usually attempts to swipe materials off of the table in order to escape from task demands. Today, Jace started to fall out of his chair in order to escape the demands that were put on him. Swiping and falling could be considered blank. So what are we looking for? What are we trying to answer? We're trying to answer the idea of what swiping and falling could be considered. And we talk about swiping and falling. What are we talking about swiping and falling in what context? Well, we know Jace likes to swipe to escape. And now Jace is falling out of his chair to escape. So we have these two responses. We have swiping, we have falling out of chair that are serving the same purpose. They're having the same effect on the environment. They're meeting the same function. When you have multiple responses that are serving the same purpose or meeting the same function, what do we call that? The same response. Well, they're not the same response, right? Swiping and falling are two distinct responses. They're different topographies, and so they're not the same response, but they could be part of the same response class. They're having the same effect on the environment. If Jace isn't swiping today, well, he's falling out of his chair. Either way, he's working on escaping a task demand. And so when we have responses that are meeting the same function, we're talking about a response class. The stimulus is not swiping and falling. Swiping and falling are the behaviors or the responses. The stimulus is likely the task demand. And it's not a stimulus class, right? Because swiping and falling are not stimuli, they are responses. And so Jace, sitting there engaging in these behaviors that are serving the same purpose, meaning the same function, is talking about the same response class. Which of the following examples does not represent a condition or discrimination? Now, if you watched our recent task list series video, we went over conditional and simple discriminations. Now, with discriminations in ABA, we're simply identifying or choosing or working between different stimuli. So we don't want to make it more complicated than it is. When we talk simple discriminations, we're typically talking a three-term contingency with an SD, a response, and a consequence. With a conditional discrimination, there's an extra stimulus here at the beginning, making it a four-term contingency, which is leading to the discrimination. And so if we're looking for examples that do not represent conditional discrimination, we're looking for discrimination that is happening just simply due to the SD and no additional antecedent stimuli. Look at A. You place a square, triangle, and circle on a table. You hold up a circle and tell your client to put it on the circle. So the SD is going to be saying to your client, put it on the circle. The extra stimulus leading to discrimination is holding up the circle. So A would be conditional discrimination. B, you start to walk to the kitchen when your friend asks you to grab them a cold beer. So you go into the fridge and find the beer. What is the SD? Well, you go to the fridge and the SD is looking at the drinks and you see the beer, discriminate between the beer and the other things in the fridge, and you grab that beer. Why were you discriminating? Because your friend asked you to grab them a cold beer. That was the extra stimulus leading to the discrimination. That's conditional. And then C, you say to your son, grab your soccer uniform. So they do. Here, we simply have an SD, grab your soccer uniform, and a response. There's no additional stimulus leading to the discrimination. It's simply a three-term contingency. And so the following examples, what does not represent a conditional discrimination, well, it's going to be C. You say to your son, grab your soccer uniform, so they do. Again, don't overcomplicate discrimination. It's simply identifying between different stimuli. The main difference between a conditional discrimination is with conditional discrimination, there's going to be an extra antecedent which leads to the actual discrimination. It leads to why you're discriminating between the stimuli in the first place. So you went to the fridge, and you found a beer because your friend gave you that extra antecedent stimulus, which led to the discrimination. So in this case, what doesn't represent a conditional discrimination is C. You say to your son, grab your soccer uniform, so they do. Thanks for watching. Be sure to subscribe on YouTube if you haven't already. Check out behavioranalyststudy.com for all of our study materials. When you pass your exam, let us know so we can include you in the Sunday shoutout. Work hard, study hard. See you soon.